Now, I would like to pose a question to Mrs. Flor. How do you see the future of the situation evolving? What kind of ways out would you see in the current situation in terms of Ukraine, in the specter of Ukraine? I know you were talking about, but still, I mean, what is the practical way out? Do you see any ways? Thank you.
Thank you. Now, let me just say that in terms of the Ukraine crisis, of course, the implementation of the Minsk agreement is the key, and that's, you know, the message that was also reaffirmed during the last meeting in the Normandy format by all participants, that we should strive for implementation of Minsk. And of course, I do think that full implementation of the Minsk agreements on Ukraine actually would have a positive impact on the overall security environment. So in that sense, and here let me say that I agree with explicitly with, you know, some of also the proposals just made by Mr. Arbatov. We should recommit to the principles of arms control, of you know, confidence building, of the strategic balance. I think it's important to recommit to these principles. That is why I think it's not enough to say there was just some loose talk. I think that the loose talk actually signifies that we have forgotten how sensitive and how important these issues are. I mean, you know, this is part of the problem. In that sense, yes, we have to remind all of ourselves that these are extremely extremely serious issues, and therefore we should recommit to the principles. And I think, yes, another round of engagement in arms control discussions, as I've said before, would be extremely important. And of course, you know, a progress in terms of the Ukraine crisis would, in a sense, also pave the way into that direction. Therefore, it is very important. Can I make a few other comments since you've come? Yes, just to say that, yes, in terms of the delinking and linking, again, you know, we encounter that in the Vienna context when we discuss Vienna document modernization, that there are calls for, but if you want to discuss this, then we also have to discuss a lot of other issues, the prompt global strike, and, you know, but this actually links then, it leads to a situation where, you know, everything blocks, you know, one thing blocks the other issues and we cannot move forward. So we think that we need to delink the issues, we need to look at each of these issues on its merits. At the same time, however, we need to have a broader dialogue about security in Europe today. Because, again, we need to come together with the Russian Federation and with everybody else in order to look at the threat perceptions, you know, where do we see the risks for today's security in Europe, and then what can we do together towards containing these risks. And I think both of that needs to happen. One comment about the nuclear sphere. CTBT, FMCT, I mean, CTBT will go into its 20th anniversary in 2016. And I mean, it's an amazing instrument because indeed it works in the sense that, you know, the oversight, the surveillance mechanism is in place globally. You know, it's being the organization is being financed despite the fact that the treaty is not in force. So it's amazing, but it's not enough. It should really enter into force because, you know, everybody, in a sense, legally speaking, would be free to make the decision to relaunch, you know, testing. So we should finally bring this treaty into force together using 2016, the anniversary year. And we should do our best to finally also engage in serious discussions about FMCT in Geneva. And let me say that I completely agree with Monsieur Grand that the main risk is unintended escalation, and it's incidents, close calls, and we've had far too many of them already, and so therefore another area that we should focus on is really incident prevention mechanisms in the air, on the seas, in order to avoid that we get into an unintended incident and confrontation that then might spiral out of control. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Flor, and I'm very happy that you touched upon the linkage of various issues, because Mr. Arbatov was claiming that we should delink. So, Mr. Grant, what is your opinion? Should we delink or link the various issues solving the main agenda?
I think many of these issues can be negotiated on their own merit. So I don't think we need to knot them all together, and it's in a way counterproductive. We should, however, admit that there are connections between the issues. So it's extraordinarily difficult, I mean, as the Russian Federation insists on the fact that strategic conventional systems are part of the overall strategic equation when it comes to further cuts in strategic systems. And there is a valid point in this statement that the ability to go deeper into tactical cuts in Europe is also connected to the, let's say, stability on the conventional realm. I happen to have been part with some of you in the moment where CFE was frozen by the decision of the Russian Federation, the implementation of CFE. At the time, I think we were a bit cavalier about this. We felt it was okay, that this treaty was not that relevant, that it was a bit of a form of a decision that was, Mr. Putin expressing opposition to Western moves on other fronts by touching on what was seen as the least important arms control treaty. When I look back, I think that it was a very important moment because in a way, CFE was one of the first arms control treaties in the post-Cold War era. It is something that made possible a lot of choices, and the whole purpose of CFE was to make conventional war impossible in Europe. And guess what? Since CFE vanished, conventional war has made a remarkable comeback in Europe. So sometimes those treaties that seem a bit obscure specialist issues are in fact directly connected to strategic stability and overall strategic stability. So my point here is not in favor of a formal linkage between all the treaties, but into taking into account the global arms control agenda in trying to put together what Alexei and I think that all of us were arguing in favor.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. And Mr. Arbatov, I would like to come back again to Budapest Memorandum, because you didn't touch upon this memorandum when you were presenting your presentation. I don't know if it was intentionally, but still, would it be possible to comment how do you view the situation, the current situation, taking into account the Budapest Memorandum issues and statements? Thank you.
I'm tremendously sorry about everything that happened between Russia and Ukraine. And the state of our relationship now is really a tragedy. And everything that happened in Crimea and Donbass and Lugansk is something that should never have happened. Having said that, I would say that the Budapest Memorandum is not so high on the list of my grievances about this situation. I do not think that what happened to Budapest Memorandum will in any way affect nuclear non-proliferation or nuclear proliferation. There is no such link. When Libya was attacked after disclosing its nuclear sites, many people said, you see, Libya disclosed its possession of some nuclear materials and technologies, and then it was attacked. If it didn't do that, it wouldn't have been attacked. So it will send a bad message to other countries that if they do something secretly and do away with it, then they will be attacked. Well, that didn't happen. We've had an agreement with Iran, which for all its controversies is a positive step forward. So, I repeat again, I think that situation in Europe, return of some elements of Cold War, economic sanctions, close encounters in intensive military exercise between Russia and NATO are all very dangerous and should be done away with as soon as possible. As for Budapest Memorandum and the effect for nuclear proliferation, I think that it's quite low on the list.
Thank you very much. Thank you, really. I would like to give the floor now to the audience. And please present yourself when asking the question. And I will start from the first row, the gentleman over there, and then you, and then you.
Thank you very much. Tarek Rauf from CIPRI. My questions were to Patricia, Flor, and particularly your comments at the very end about the importance of the FMCT and the CTBT. And I wanted to relate this to, of the 8 states that have still to sign and or ratify, India and Pakistan are 2 that have not yet signed or ratified. But in the nuclear suppliers group, one of those states has been given an exemption and there was no condition attached. For example, India to sign on to the CTBT. So it's very well to call for the entry into force of the CTBT, but where states have leverage, they don't exercise that leverage. And secondly, with regard to the FMCT, its purpose originally was both disarmament and non-proliferation. We have lost the non-proliferation battle with India, Pakistan, DPRK carrying out nuclear tests. So now the value of an FMCT is primarily disarmament, which means it has to include stocks. And a treaty without stocks makes no sense. So now I was wondering if you could comment on those. Thank you.
I'm Carlo Trezza from Italy. I think that I share Alexei Arbatov's reading of how we have come back to this Cold War situation in Europe, and the theme of the neglect of nuclear issues for 25 years is indeed one of the causes. I fully agree with him. So we are back to this situation of confrontation. The only non-negative element is that there's no real ideological divide between Russia and the West. So there's no really fundamental issue dividing the two sides. As far as the Budapest Memorandum is concerned, I mean, there's no doubt that Russia did not abide by this text. The lesson learned is that in these cases, and to discipline issues like nuclear security, you need legally binding instruments. And the memorandum is not a legally binding instrument. So I mean, this is a lesson for the future. As far as the use of nuclear rhetoric, this is a serious issue. In the fundamental texts, the use and threat of nuclear weapons is basically put in the same basket. And therefore, I think that leaders should be, and not only leaders, but even officials, should be very cautious in making statements on the use of nuclear weapons without any control. One of the shocks, I think, for Europe as a whole was that all the instruments that we had devised during the Cold War precisely to prevent situations of confrontations, especially within the framework of the OSCE, have not worked. And therefore we are very confident now in the incoming German presidency to handle that subject as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Professor Rafi from Morocco. My first point is upon the Ukrainian crisis. I want to know if one former president, Russian President Medvedev, said to the reporter of the newspaper, French newspaper Le Monde, that Russia should intervene in Georgia, even if Georgia was a member of the NATO. And again, he said that when Obama wants to deploy the anti-ballistic missile in Prague, in the Czech Republic, he said we will destroy it. And after that, the President Putin said we will recourse to the nuclear weapons. These events, does it mean that Russia regard these territories as vital interests? Because as you know, there is the use of the nuclear weapons, one the vital interest of countries and at stake, I think every expert in the nuclear field knows these things. Second point is about the nuclear weapons themselves. I find a little bit naively odd and ridiculous, especially for some Western experts, in the nuclear weapons, who think that it's possible that the nuclear weapons will disappear, because we notice, after the destruction of the Iraqi nuclear program, that the experts, the know-how, the qualified manpower, they immigrate to Libya, and then from Libya to Algeria, and we have also, I think Mr. Arbatov knows this better than me, we have the Russian atomists who immigrate to Iran. So it's impossible. It's possible that nuclear weapons will disappear. I think the nuclear weapons will still be standing weapons, especially we live in this equilibrium. The international security is based on this unique pillar, nuclear weapons. And my last question is to the German commissioner, which I appreciate very much, her very excellent speech. Some years ago, we have discussed the possibility to destroy the 240 nuclear weapons in Europe, which has been deployed by the Americans from 1957. I think these weapons, to my knowledge, these weapons are deployed in Belgium here, and also in Germany and maybe in Holland. But my question to Patricia, Flor, now after the threat to recourse to nuclear weapons by the Russian Putin, how is the debate? How is the point of view of the German government? Because I know that the German government, the German country, they fear the invasion of Russia. Do they now? They are for the destruction of these nuclear weapons, or they want to keep them on their soil? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And in the future, when asking questions, please limit yourself to some short time, because we have a lot of questions, and the time is very short and limited. I would like to invite Mrs. Flor to answer, and then on the...
Thank you. No, I'll do my best to be brief. First of all, yes, of course we are not naive in terms of CTBT, but we think that we have to try our best to make it enter into force, because I don't think that anybody can seriously argue today that you still need to test nuclear weapons in order to, defend yourself. I don't think it's true, and also not for other, regions of the world, like in Asia or between India and Pakistan. I don't think that this argument holds. Therefore, we think there should be a joint effort by everyone to try to get to ratification. And believe me, I'm saying the same thing in Washington and in other capitals of the world. And I think it must be a joint effort to get there. On FMCT, well, the issue of stocks, of course, is that's the main hurdle, and I don't have a solution for it. Of course, for Germany as a non-nuclear weapons state, we could easily contemplate to also look at the stocks. But it's a no-go for others. And so therefore, I think that we have to try to get to an entry into discussing these issues at least, because as you know, we haven't even started seriously to really go back into exchanging views and checking, doing what arms control negotiations always were, namely, even if it's very complicated, to identify the tiny element where maybe you can make some progress. So our call is, let's at least start to discuss these very serious issues again in Geneva. Just one point on the NSA, the negative security assurances. Yes, we think we should look at legally binding element. We should try to see, can we go beyond the NPT? Can we find a way to make it binding? Then nukes never to disappear. Well, I think politicians or diplomats should be realistic and pragmatic, but they should also be visionary. There's no good policy unless you actually know what your final goal is. And if it's easily achievable, that's easy. If it's hard to achieve, it's all the more important to keep this vision in mind, and that it's a step-by-step, that it's a long path, there's no question. But by the way, on this path, at some stage, CTBT, for instance, will be an essential step. Now, nukes in Europe, I mean, the German government view on this, it's not the security environment within which we operate at this moment is not right for actually looking at fundamental changes in terms of, the strategy, the posture. That's where we are. We regret it because certainly, the German public would be, would immediately, be in favor of, and has called many times, and certainly also our, the main, parties which, are part of the German government also would want to move into that direction, but it will require a certain security environment. Therefore, we try to improve the environment where we are in at the moment.
Thank you. Mr. Arbatov, your comments.
Well, as far as I could understand the question, I think my neighbor responded very well.
No, please, Mr. Grant, your comments?
Very, very quickly, I very much subscribe to what has been told on FMCT and CTBT. The only thing I would add is that those a bit neglected multilateral agreements or negotiations are important in the general atmospherics as well, because it does mean that experts, diplomats do meet, to look into issues, and I think it fosters effort from more bilateral processes. On the Budapest Memorandum, yes, we should favor legally binding instrument. I would be slightly less optimistic than Alexei on the impact on the non-proliferation regime. I tend to believe that now it would be almost impossible to sell to any country denuclearization based on a promise, especially if it's not legally binding, not to attack them in the future. And by the way, this was not part of the Iran nuclear agreement. Lastly, on NATO and tactical nukes, we should keep in mind that NATO has reduced the number of weapons deployed to Europe by the US by, I think, 98% since the peak of the Cold War. This is quite unique. By the way, it's a story that can't be told because NATO is not transparent about these numbers. So this is something that I always challenge a bit with my NATO friends, that when you have a good story, you should be in a position to tell it. Fortunately, WikiLeaks solves part of that problem, but nevertheless, it is there. So this is important. A last point on the issue of NATO membership. We do have in Europe a gray zone problem. That is those countries that are in between NATO and the Russian Federation, with each have their own foreign policy agenda. And this is not surprisingly where a lot of the security developments have taken place. To these dates, and I certainly hope and I'm quite certain it will remain true, for NATO and EU members, the issue is not there in the same terms. But this is something that is part of a problem and should be part of a conversation about stability in Europe. Thank you very much.
Yes, there was a question, right, which was, yes, Russia considers post-Soviet space as an area of vital interest, vital security interest, no question about it. Deployment of foreign troops or ballistic missile defenses in this area would be seen as a threat to Russian security. It doesn't mean that Russia would attack either with conventional or nuclear weapons those sites, just like the sites in Poland or Romania or Turkey. But it means that Russia will consider those sites to be legitimate targets for Russian conventional precision-guided systems like Iskander or even nuclear systems in case of nuclear war. There was, as I mentioned, there was loose talk about nuclear weapons on the side of Russia, but there were even more loose interpretation in the West of what was said. If you look through all the declarations of Putin and Medvedev, all those declarations were made in the context of nuclear deterrence, not in the context of Russia attacking somebody. Some words of some ambassadors were not officially authorized, no question about that. But you should look at what Minister of Defense, Foreign Minister, Prime Minister, President say. They were saying it in the context of nuclear deterrence. Should they have done it? No. I think that it was wrong to put such an accent on nuclear weapons in the context of Ukrainian crisis. That was wrong. But those people making decisions in the Kremlin, they were scared by the possibility of NATO intervention in Crimea, Donbass, and Lugansk. And their perception of the West was as of quite an aggressive alliance, which moved to Russian borders during the last 20 years, very close. Hence, they maybe have overdone their warnings. But they always talked about deterrence, not about being the first to attack. Now about ballistic missile defense. Russia considers ballistic missile defense in Europe to be directed against Russian nuclear deterrence. I personally think that this is very exaggerated perception, that the system deployed in Europe now is no threat to Russian nuclear deterrence. But there is another opinion which is obviously shared in the Russian government and political elite, the majority of the political elite. And I would suggest that the United States did very little to really dispel this concern. They did very little to make commitments that defense will be limited so that it does not threaten Russian strategic deterrence. We know that the current program cannot do that. Experts know it. But it's an open-ended program, and it may continue and expand, especially if there is a change in administration. We have no commitments on the part of the United States that it would somehow be limited. So that's why there is this concern in Russia. And the last comment is that about reconfirming our understanding that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. Recently at Valdai, President Putin, all of a sudden, after talking about Syria, made several extensive comments on the subject. He referred to the leaders of the past who were responsible. He referred to present leaders who are not so responsible, and he repeated, even if indirectly, the notion that nuclear war will be devastating and there may be no victors in nuclear war. Maybe it was a signal to President Obama to say something like that, and I will be waiting and following whether President Obama would also reiterate on this subject in the same way.
Thank you very much. And then I promised the gentleman in the middle, yes, and I will continue with the left side, and after on the next part we will continue with the right side. So the gentleman in the middle, then the gentleman on the very left, and the other gentleman in the very back. So please.
Okay, Tom Sauer from the University of Antwerp.
And I'm sorry to remind you to limit yourself in some short time.
Camille linked the B-61 issue to the Ukraine crisis. Now, it should, however, be clear that no serious efforts were made to withdraw these last B-61 bombs in the years before the Ukraine crisis. So the Ukraine crisis misused by the advocates of those bombs in Europe, including the French. And as far as I know, Germany is planning to replace the current dual-capable aircraft with non-dual-capable aircraft, Eurofighter, which means phasing out the B-61 role by default in 5 or 10 years. And also my own government, Belgium, has not yet decided to renew the DCA role. And the Dutch parliament passed a motion for a non-nuclear Joint Strike Fighter in 2013. So there's an opportunity for coordination amongst Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, I believe. So prove that this step-by-step approach is working.
Thank you. Gentleman in the very left over there. No, not you. It's somebody else over there asking. Yes, you, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Ted C. from BASIC in London, and I'd like to echo what Dr. Sauer just said, particularly in challenging the representative of the German government who made an on-the-record statement that Germany is a non-nuclear weapons state. And in the same sense the EU claims to have clean hands on nuclear non-proliferation, I have to challenge both of those assertions because of the presence since the 1950s on inter alia German soil of US nuclear weapons, when the clear plan on NATO's part is in time of crisis or war to turn those weapons over to the very capable hands of the Luftwaffe.
Thank you. And then the gentleman in the, yes, in the very last row over there. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Heinz Gärtner. I'm from Vienna. I have a question to Patricia Flor. You just said that NATO is not going to change its nuclear posture anytime soon. But at the beginning you said you would support the humanitarian dimension. So I don't see any possible progress in the humanitarian dimension if you don't address the nuclear posture of NATO. I just want to remind you of among those about 120 states which signed the humanitarian pledge was not only no nuclear weapon states, but there was also no NATO member. So I don't know how you can bridge this gap, supporting the humanitarian dimension at the same time accepting the nuclear posture, so especially what we heard from the panel after the Ukraine crisis.
Thank you. And now the answers.
Yes, thank you. Now, I'll start with the last question. Now, there was always a German delegation at the different conferences on the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, because we completely agree that any use, and I reminded of Nagasaki and Hiroshima earlier, any use of such a weapon has catastrophic humanitarian consequences, and so certainly nobody should therefore ever contemplate using these weapons. And with that, we completely agree. That was the key part of the humanitarian initiative when they started. Now, the Austrian pledge and the call for a ban convention against nuclear weapons, that's a step more, and that is a step which we cannot take. We cannot take it because at this moment we don't see that the P5 and those who actually do possess nuclear weapons would in any way be ready actually to sign up to this convention. And what is the use of an instrument that does not really get those who do possess these kind of weapons to disarm and to then bring us closer to our vision of a world free of nuclear weapons. So the contradiction from our point of view is also in this proposal, which is the reason why we will work and continue to work with the humanitarian initiative. But we think that the way to bring forward our vision is this very tedious and painful step-by-step process where we have to bring the weapon states along towards nuclear disarmament. Therefore, we welcome full implementation of New START, and we would wish to see another round of disarmament. Nuclear sharing. Well, it is very clear, legally speaking, that Germany and the practice of nuclear sharing is completely in line with the NPT. And as you know, of course, Germany is a treaty party to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. So it's very clear, and therefore, any claim that there would be a contradiction does not hold true. The practice of nuclear sharing actually predates the NPT, and the then Soviet Union at the time, also was fully aware of this fact and accepted it by acceding to the NPT. So there is no contradiction, and certainly also no, legal issue here. But I repeat, the practice and the deployment, it's part of the overall security environment. And so in that sense, I do think that, we have to relook at that over and over again, but we need to do it in the context of hopefully also arms control talks and progress. And at the moment, we don't have that in the security field.
I would like to give the floor to Camille Grant.
Very briefly on the issue of the B-61, what I was pointing at is that I perceive that the debate is evolving. Most of the debate of the last 10 years was about should these weapons be removed or not. There is indeed a continued push on some part of the, especially civil society, political parties in Europe in favor of that move, but there is also more of a debate about a growing debate on the need to modernize the systems. So my main point here was to state that when the, let's say, general thrust of the debate was towards elimination of the system eventually on a unilateral basis, this is no longer the policies of NATO countries as we speak. There is indeed a debate in NATO. There's also a debate in the US, and the decisions have been taken by the Obama administration to modernize these systems and to give a dual capability to the F-35 that will ensure that the systems are able to operate in the medium to long term. And then there is indeed a debate in the countries that operate those dual capable aircrafts. And there is a strong disconnection between those that have taken decisions to buy the F-35 and will therefore de facto be able to operate the B-61 in the future, Italy, Turkey, potentially the Netherlands, even though there is a political decision to be associated with that, and the countries that have not yet or taken such a decision, which for the moment are sort of prolonging the lifespan of the existing aircraft. This is a decision that will have to be taken by the Belgian government and the German government, because indeed there is at some point in the future, there will be a technical issue to be fixed, which is even if you station the weapons, if you don't have the planes to fly them, you're de facto moving out of the DCA game. But my real emphasis is on the fact that this debate has, I think, fundamentally changed, not because of Ukraine, but not even though it was not stated this way. I think it is a changing and evolving debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arbatov, you wanted to ask some comments?
Tactical nuclear weapons certainly are a legitimate subject for arms control, but it requires a lot of innovative thinking and exploration to find a way of dealing with those. Mechanically applying strategic arms control experience to tactical nukes is a non-starter. They are very different weapons. They are not kept on day-to-day alert. They are in storages in peacetime. You cannot count them by counting delivery systems because the delivery systems are dual purpose. You cannot apply the notion of parity to tactical nukes because, for instance, in Russia, tactical nukes are not only assigned the tasks in the West, and Russia's geostrategic situation has to be taken into account. And you cannot apply the notion of strategic stability, which is based on secure second strike retaliation. You cannot apply that to tactical nuclear weapons either. So you have to do a lot of thinking before proposing it or making it a practical negotiation. In the past, some years ago, President Obama proposed to cut down strategic nuclear arms after a new start, to lower ceiling, and also to bunch together tactical nukes. That was done on the wave of euphoria about the progress towards nuclear disarmament, so nobody cared to ask those practical questions. Now that we will have to postpone total and comprehensive nuclear disarmament for some time into the future, is the time to think about practicalities of tactical nukes to make it possible when political situation becomes more favorable.
Thank you very much. And now I need to apologize the right side of the audience because the organizers are very strict with me and they told me that I have to stop at this point the discussion as we have a lunch in our agenda waiting for us. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to stop here and I would like to encourage you to ask the questions during the lunch or during coffee breaks. And I would like to invite you to applaud our very interesting, very knowledgeable speakers who presented very well today. And enjoy your lunch. Thank you.